In the late spring of 1976, Nora Fielding came home. She was 26 years old, with a degree in soil science from a university back east, and her hands, though calloused from lab work and field studies, looked impossibly clean to the men who had known her since she was a girl. She returned not to the familiar clapboard farmhouse of her youth, but to the land itself, specifically to one piece of it that her family had ignored for 2 generations. The steep, unforgiving, west-facing hillside that her father, John Fielding, simply called the Burden. To him it was 30 acres of rock, scrub oak, and disappointment, a place where the earth was too canted to hold a plow, and too poor to grow anything but weeds and resentment. It was a scar on the otherwise productive landscape of their Oregon farm. Let me tell you about that hillside. It wasn't just steep, it was a geological argument. It rose from the valley floor at an angle that seemed to defy gravity, a wall of clay and stone that caught the afternoon sun with a harsh, reflective glare. For 50 years, the Fielding men had looked at that slope and seen only what they could not do. They could not run a tractor across it. They could not graze cattle on it without the risk of them tumbling. They could not plant the neat, profitable rows of filberts or corn that carpeted the rest of their property. It was a monument to impossibility, a constant, silent reminder of the limits of their ambition and their machinery. Her grandfather had tried once, a failed experiment with pasture grass in the 30s that ended with a summer thunderstorm washing a decade's worth of topsoil into the creek below. After that, it was forbidden territory. Now, let me explain what Nora saw. She did not see an obstacle. She saw a solution. Her degree had not just filled her head with facts about loam and aggregate stability. It had taught her how to read the land's own language. Where her father saw useless rock, she saw thermal mass, stones that would soak up the day's heat and radiate it back through the cool nights, protecting tender buds. Where he saw a steep, eroding pitch, she saw perfect, God-given drainage, a place where water would never stand and rot the roots of a delicate plant. She walked that hill for a week, her boots slipping on the loose shale, her hands grabbing at tough, wild grasses. She carried a soil auger, a thermometer, and a notebook. She wasn't just looking, she was listening to what the earth had been trying to say for centuries. She discovered things her father, in all his years of practical farming, had never imagined. The soil, while thin, had a peculiar mineral composition, a flinty character she'd only read about in textbooks on French terroir. She found that the slope created its own microclimates. Pockets of air near the top were consistently 5 to 7 degrees warmer than the valley floor after sunset. The cold, dense air of the night didn't settle there. It slid down the grade, draining away like water, leaving the upper reaches of the hillside in a protected thermal belt. It was a perfect, natural defense against the late spring frosts that could decimate a crop in a single night. She came to the dinner table one evening, her face smudged with dirt and her eyes bright with a fervor her father hadn't seen since she was a child who believed in fairy tales. She spread her maps and soil charts across the worn oak surface. "I know what to do with the burden," she said, her voice quiet but firm. John Fielding finished his stew, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He was a man shaped by the land he understood, flat, predictable, and honest. He did not trust things that were complicated or lived at an angle. "There's nothing to be done with it," he said. It was not a suggestion. It was a law of nature. "It's worthless. I'm thinking of selling it to the timber company. They can get at it from the top ridge. Might get a few thousand for the trouble." Nora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "You can't," she said. "It's not worthless. It's the most valuable piece of land we have." Her father sighed, the sound of a man who had heard too many new ideas and found all of them wanting. "Nora, you've been away. You have your books and your numbers. I have 60 years of dirt under my nails. That hill won't grow a thing. It will grow grapes," she said. "Not just any grapes, a specific clone of Pinot Noir, one that needs the struggle, one that needs the drainage and the warm nights. It will make wine like no one in this valley has ever tasted." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and saw not his daughter, the scientist, but a dreamer. And he feared for her. In his world, dreams were a luxury that led to foreclosure. "There's no money for that," he said, his voice softer now. "There's no equipment for it. There's no market for it. The big wineries like Mr. Vance's place, they have the flat land, the best land. They have the reputation. We're filbert farmers, Nora. We are not vintners." "I don't need money," she countered, though she knew she did. "I need time, and I need you not to sell that hill." The argument went on for weeks. It was a quiet, painful war fought over breakfast coffee and evening chores. To her father, her insistence was a betrayal of everything he had taught her: practicality, caution, the avoidance of debt and risk. To Nora, his refusal was a blindness, an inability to see the potential that was screaming at her from the hillside. The land remembered, she thought, and it was waiting for someone to finally understand its story. Then, in the dusty attic, while searching for old canning jars, she found the source of her conviction. It was not a memory of her own, but one that had been sleeping in a wooden trunk for half a century. It was her great-grandfather's book, brought over from the old country, from a region in Germany where vineyards clung to river valley slopes so steep they seemed painted onto the landscape. The book was bound in faded green leather, its title embossed in a language she couldn't read, but inside, the pages were filled with exquisite hand-drawn diagrams. It was a masterclass in the forgotten art of hillside farming. "Let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever held an object that felt more like a teacher than a thing?" This book was such an object. It was a testament to a different kind of wisdom, one born not of engines and chemical fertilizers, but of sweat, stone, and an intimate, generations-spanning conversation with a single piece of land. It showed how to build dry-stacked stone terraces without mortar, using gravity and friction as their only binding agents. It detailed how to orient the rows not for the convenience of a machine, but to capture the morning sun and shelter the vines from the harshest afternoon heat. It spoke of cover crops that would hold the thin soil in place, their roots a living net woven through the earth. This book became her Bible and her blueprint. It was the ancestral wisdom her own family had forgotten, a tangible legacy of knowledge that had crossed an ocean only to be packed away and dismissed. Her great-grandfather had been a vintner. He had tried to tell his son, who had tried to tell his son, John, but the lure of the flat, easy land of America had been too strong. The hard-won knowledge of the slopes was deemed obsolete. Until now. Nora made her father a promise. "Give me 5 years," she pleaded. "Don't sell the land. I'll do all the work myself. I won't ask you for $1. If in 5 years I have nothing to show for it, the hill is yours to sell." He looked at her worn face, the stubborn set of her jaw that was so much like his own, and he relented. Not because he believed in her, but because he loved her, and he couldn't bring himself to break her spirit just yet. He saw 5 years of back-breaking, fruitless labor ahead of her, a harsh lesson he hoped would cure her of her academic fantasies. He agreed. The subsequent 2 decades were a masterclass in patience, a long, slow poem written in stone and soil. That first summer, Nora began the work. She started at the bottom of the slope, clearing the brush by hand with a scythe and a mattock. The sun beat down on her, and the neighbors, driving by on the county road below, would slow their trucks, shake their heads, and murmur to one another about John Fielding's poor, educated fool of a daughter. They saw a lone woman engaged in a pointless, punishing war against a hill that had already defeated generations of men. She learned the language of the stone. Each rock she pried from the earth with a long steel bar had a shape and a weight that told her where it belonged in the terrace walls. She was not merely clearing the land. She was harvesting its bones and using them to build its new skeleton. Her hands, once soft, became gnarled and permanently stained with the red of the clay. She worked from sunrise until the light failed, her muscles screaming in protest. In the evenings, she would study the German book, her fingers tracing the elegant old-world script, matching the diagrams to the challenges she had faced that day. The land was not an enemy. The book taught her that. It was a partner, and it demanded respect and understanding before it would yield its gifts. Then, in 1979, Arthur Vance drove by. Vance owned the largest, most successful winery in the county, a sprawling estate on the rich, flat bottomland that was the envy of every farmer. He was a man who believed that quality came from capital investment and modern technology. He saw Nora halfway up the slope, her small figure stark against the raw earth, wrestling a boulder into place. He stopped his gleaming Lincoln Continental, a cloud of dust settling around it. He was with an investor from California. Vance gestured up the hill with a dismissive wave of his hand. "That's what happens when you send a farm girl to college," he said, his voice carrying on the still air. "She comes back thinking she knows more than her own father, trying to grow grapes on a cliff. She'll be lucky to grow a crop of broken bones." He chuckled, a rich, confident sound. The investor chuckled with him. Nora heard him. Every word was like a stone striking her. She did not turn around. She did not shout back. She simply set her shoulder against the boulder and heaved, seating it firmly in the wall. The laughter from the road was the sound of the world telling her she was wrong. The solid thud of the stone settling into place was her reply. There were moments of private doubt. Of course there were. One winter, a storm blew in from the coast, a deluge of rain that turned her half-finished terraces into muddy waterfalls. For 2 days, she watched as her work dissolved before her eyes. She sat in the farmhouse kitchen, soaked and shivering, the smell of wet earth filling the air. Her father sat with her, his silence a heavy blanket of, "I told you so." In that moment, she considered surrender. The hill was too strong. The world was too skeptical. Her own body was reaching its limit. That night, she opened the old German book. She found a chapter on winter erosion, with a delicate drawing of a specific type of clover, its deep taproot illustrated like an anchor. The text, which she had painstakingly begun to translate with a German-English dictionary, spoke of this plant as the winter stitch, a living thread that held the soil together when the rains came. The next spring, she did not plant vines. She planted clover. The whispers from the community grew louder. She was not just a fool. She was a lazy fool, planting a weed instead of a crop. But the clover grew. Its roots, as promised, stitched the soil to the hillside. The following year, the terraces held. The land was healing. The land was learning. She began planting the vines, carefully selected clones she'd sourced from a specialty nursery. They were little more than sticks, fragile and vulnerable. She tended them like infants, watering them by hand, carrying buckets up the steep slope until her arms felt like they would pull from their sockets. The first signs of success were subtle, visible only to her. The deep, healthy green of the leaves, the way the tendrils curled and clung to the guide wires with a fierce, determined grip. The soil itself was changing. It was no longer a dead mineral substance, but was becoming alive, dark and fragrant with the life she had fostered within it. The soil was asleep, and she had gently woken it. 5 years came and went. She had something to show for it. A series of 23 immaculate, grass-covered terraces, rising like the steps of an ancient amphitheater, and on them a few hundred young, thriving grapevines. It was not a harvest. It was not a profit. But it was a promise. Her father, to his credit, honored their agreement. He said nothing, but he stopped talking about the timber company. He would sometimes watch her from the barn, his face a mask of confusion and a reluctant, nascent respect. He saw the order she had carved from chaos. He didn't understand it, but he could not deny its existence. The subsequent 2 decades were a blur of seasons. The vines matured, their trunks thickening, their roots delving deep into the hillside, pulling sustenance from the very rock she had once cursed. She had her first small harvest in 1982, a few lugs of grapes that she crushed herself in a small, hand-cranked press. She fermented the juice in glass carboys in the cellar. The wine was raw and powerful, but it tasted of the hill. It tasted of flint and wild cherry and a faint, earthy note of clover. It tasted of her struggle. She worked alone, a solitary figure in her vineyard on the hill. She became a local curiosity, the eccentric woman who talked to her vines and read an old German book. Other farms modernized, grew larger, took on debt. Nora's world remained small, focused, and entirely her own. She owed nothing to the bank. Her only debt was to the land, and she repaid it every day with her labor. Then came the spring of 1994. It was a year of perfect weather. The vines grew with an almost explosive energy, and the fruit set was heavy and beautiful. A bumper crop was expected all across the valley. Arthur Vance boasted in the local paper that it would be the vintage of the century. Then, in late April, the forecasters began to speak of a polar vortex, a mass of Arctic air plunging south. A hard frost was coming, a killer frost. Let me tell you about a killing frost in wine country. It is a silent, creeping death. The temperature drops 1 degree at a time, and the tender new shoots on the vines, the ones that hold the promise of the entire year's crop, begin to freeze. The water inside their cells expands, turning to ice, rupturing the cell walls from within. By morning, a field of vibrant green can be transformed into a blackened, withered wasteland. An entire year's income, an entire farm's hope, can be extinguished between midnight and dawn. That night, the valley floor became a war zone of desperation. Farmers lit smudge pots, great drums of burning oil that filled the air with a choking black smoke, a futile attempt to raise the temperature by a degree or two. Giant wind machines like helicopter propellers on towers roared to life, churning the air to mix the warmer layers above with the deadly cold settling on the ground. From her hillside, Nora could see the fires and hear the drone of the engines. The valley looked like a vision of hell. She did nothing. There was nothing she could do. She had no smudge pots, no wind machines. Her faith was in the hill, in the wisdom of the old book, and in the science of her own studies. She walked the terraces as the temperature plummeted, a thermometer in her hand. On the valley floor, the news reports said it had hit 26 degrees, a catastrophic freeze. On her hillside, her thermometer never dipped below 33. The cold air, heavy and dense, was flowing around her, sliding down her carefully engineered slopes and away into the valley, a river of cold that she was not a part of. She was on an island of relative warmth in a sea of frozen air. The land was protecting its own. The next morning, the sun rose on a scene of absolute devastation. The vineyards on the valley floor were gone. Arthur Vance's prized acres were a field of black, drooping leaves. Millions of dollars of crops had been wiped out in a single night. But on Nora Fielding's hill, the vines were untouched. They glistened with dew, their green shoots reaching for the morning sun as if nothing had happened. The harvest that year was hers alone. The grapes ripened to a perfect dark-skinned sweetness. She made the wine, and for the first time, she bottled it with a simple, elegant label: Fielding Hillside. She had so little of it, only a few hundred cases, but she knew it was special. On a whim, she sent a bottle to a national wine competition, a prestigious event judged by critics who had never heard of her farm, or her valley. 6 months later, a letter arrived. Her wine had not just won a medal. It had won Best in Show. It had been judged the single finest Pinot Noir in the entire country. The news spread like wildfire. At first, no one believed it. It had to be a mistake. But then the articles appeared in magazines. The phone started ringing, and distributors from New York and San Francisco were calling, begging to buy wine that didn't exist yet. One afternoon, the gleaming Lincoln Continental returned. It drove slowly up her gravel lane and stopped near the barn. Arthur Vance got out. He was older now, his face lined with the worry of the last few years. The frost had nearly ruined him. He stood for a moment, looking not at her, but up at the terraced hillside, at the impossible vineyard that had survived and triumphed. He walked over to where she was pruning a vine. He held his hat in his hands. "The frost," he said, his voice quiet. It was not a question. "It missed the hill," Nora replied, not looking up from her work. "How?" he asked. "How did you know?" She finally straightened up and looked at him. She thought of his laughter all those years ago. She felt no triumph, only a quiet, weary satisfaction. "The cold air is heavy," she said. "It sinks. It just needed a place to go. The hill gave it one." He nodded slowly, absorbing the simple, profound truth he had never seen. "The wine, the award," he stammered. "They say it's remarkable. I'd like to buy your entire vintage. I'll pay you double whatever anyone else has offered." "It's already sold," she said simply. He stood there for a long moment. He was the gatekeeper, the man who had set the rules for success in the valley, and she had broken every one of them and won. "I apologize," he said, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "For what I said all those years ago. I was wrong." He extended a hand. She took it. The handshake was brief, but it was a treaty that redrew the map of their entire world. The more important acknowledgement came later. Her father found her on the hill, walking the highest terrace as the sun set, casting a golden light on the valley below. A valley that now looked to this hill with awe instead of pity. He stood beside her, his old work boots planted firmly on the soil he had once called worthless. He looked at the healthy, mature vines, the sturdy rock walls, the order and beauty of it all. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he cleared his throat. "Your great-grandfather," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "He came from a place like this, steep hills, hard work. He tried to make a go of it here, but the times were different. We all wanted the easy way." He finally turned to look at her. "You have his hands and his heart." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. It showed a young man standing proudly in front of a steep, terraced vineyard in Germany. It was her great-grandfather. "I was wrong, Nora," John Fielding said, his voice finally breaking. "All these years I was so wrong. This isn't the burden. It's our legacy. You brought it back." He looked at the land, his land, with new eyes. He was seeing it through her, and for the first time, he understood. The hill was not a thing to be sold. It was a thing to be earned. Let me tell you what happened after that. The story of Nora Fielding became a legend, a parable told in wineries and farming co-ops across the country. Fielding Hillside became one of the most sought-after wines in the world, each bottle a testament to patience and a deep understanding of place. Nora never expanded much. She kept it small, manageable, a conversation between herself, the hill, and the vines. She bought the rest of the family farm from her father, giving him a comfortable retirement, and she worked the land, both the flat and the steep, with a reverence that changed the way people farmed in that valley. Years later, decades later, you could find her there, an old woman now, her hair the color of silver, her hands as gnarled as the trunks of her oldest vines. She was a respected elder, the quiet master of the hill, and she was never alone. There were always young, aspiring vintners with her, apprentices with notebooks and soil augers, listening as she explained the language of the land. She would show them the thermal belt, the importance of drainage, the living community in the soil. And sometimes, when an apprentice was ready, she would take them to the farmhouse, and from a locked chest, she would take out an old leather-bound book. She would pass it to them, its pages soft as cloth from a century of use. "This is where the real knowledge is," she would say. "The machines change, the chemicals change, but the land remembers, and so must we." Her father had said the hillside was too steep to farm. He saw only the impossibility. Nora kept the farm. She listened to the hill, and the land remembered her for it. It remembered, and it repaid her in kind, with a legacy that would outlast them all.